You and I all have questions. We have questions about a lot of things, and some of them are big questions. I'm excited this morning to explore with you the 3 big God questions everyone has and why it's not a bad thing. Let's open our Bibles to the book of Habakkuk, chapter 1.
My mom was 31 when she lost her sister to a car accident. They were very close, and it was devastating for my mom. 3 years later, my mom lost her mother to cancer. My mom was 30 when I was born, so when my grandmother died, I was 4, and when my aunt had passed away, I was just a little over 1 year old. So I had no memory or recollection of them personally. But I did grow up in a house where there were times where my mom would be emotional, and I remember this from a very young age. I remember my mom becoming very sad and upset at times in her life, and I remember that she would say this. She would say, "I know we're not supposed to question God, but I can't help but wonder why." And I remember her saying that on more than one occasion. "I know that we're not supposed to question God," she would say, "but I can't help but wonder why." And she was referencing, obviously, the car accident of her sister and the loss of her mother to cancer. She was referencing that very painful season, and she wondered if God is in control, then why? But she still prefaced it with this deep-seated belief she had that you're not supposed to question God. So I grew up in that environment that whatever happens, I'm just supposed to accept it and put that in the file of the sovereign God and just move on, grin and bear it. And you know what? The older I've gotten and the more familiar I've become with the Bible, I don't know. As much as I love my mom, I think she missed it on that one. Because the more familiar I become with the Bible, what I find is that there were some very godly men and women who asked some very big questions of God. I mean, they asked some big ones. When you go back to Genesis chapter 17, God tells Abraham, "I'm going to give you a son." Abraham's 100 years old, right? God says, "This is what I'm going to do." God reaffirms His covenant with Abraham and with Abraham's offspring and said, "I'm going to give you a son." You know what Abraham said? "How?" In Exodus chapter 5, when Pharaoh had put a greater burden on the Israelites because of what Moses was doing as an ambassador for God, Pharaoh says, "I'm going to make you make more bricks, and we're going to take away the straw." And Moses goes down to the people, and the people hate him. You know what Moses says in Exodus 5? "God, why are you doing this to your people, and why did you send me?" In Joshua chapter 7, after the utter defeat of God's people in the battle of Ai, Joshua falls down on his face and says, "God, why are you doing this? Why did you bring us here?" The prophets ask the question. Jeremiah in chapter 12 asks the question, "Why, God?" The Psalms are full, almost a third of the Psalms are full of the question, "Why? How long? When, God?" Mary, the mother of Jesus, upon hearing the announcement that she's going to give birth to the Son of God, you know what she says? "How?" That's a serious question to God. In Mark chapter 4, the disciples are out on the Sea of Galilee with Jesus. These experienced fishermen, they're out on the sea, and a giant storm arises, and they're terrified. They're so sure they're going to die, and Jesus is asleep in the boat. Do you remember what they said in Mark 4? They run over to Jesus and they wake Him up and they say, "Master, do you not care that we're perishing?" That's a serious question. That's a big God question that they ask. You know, the book of Job, most of you probably are at least familiar with the plight of Job as he lost so much in his life. And the book of Job recounts that journey of Job walking through that valley and trying to wrap his mind around all that was going on both in this world and in the world unseen. In that book of Job, there are over 10,000 words. And among those 10,000 words, there are 329 questions asked. No, that's not just Job asking God. It's Job asking God, and Job asking his friends, and his friends asking Job, and more importantly, God asking Job questions. The more familiar I've become with the Bible, I don't think it's a bad thing to have big questions for God. He's a relational God. He's more than capable of being able to handle any question I can have of Him. He wants to hear from me. He wants to experience that closeness and that relationship and that fellowship. He wants to hear from me. And I don't think it's a bad thing to ask God questions. But let me say this. When I'm talking about big God questions, let me tell you what I mean by that, so we're all working off of the same definition. When I'm talking about the big God questions, I'm not talking about our flippant responses to God. I'm not talking about those things that we might say that are veiled attacks against Him. I'm not talking about those questions that are not born from a place of faith. I'm not talking about those questions that are just a mockery of Him. No, that's not what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about the three big God questions that we have, I'm talking about the ones that are born from a place sometimes of pain, disappointment, grief, confusion. I'm talking about the ones that are born from the place where we say, God, I don't understand. God, this doesn't make sense to me. Let me be clear that when I say three big God questions everyone has, that's obviously anecdotal. I don't have a survey done that says 100% of all people in the world have asked these questions. But I would imagine if I took a survey this morning of all three of these questions and asked you to raise your hand, if you've ever asked that question in your heart to God, I would not be surprised if at the end of that every hand was raised. The other thing I want to say by way of introduction is that these questions, you may have never asked this question that we're going to study this morning verbatim. This question may not have been uttered out of your mouth the way it is uttered out from this pulpit this morning. But these three questions, even though you may not have ever asked them verbatim, these three questions are core questions. The question you may ask may not sound like this, but when you continue to say, why did I ask that question? What am I looking for? What am I truly asking? I believe what you're going to find is that all of our questions come down to one of these three core questions. I know many of you are open to Habakkuk. Let me give you just a brief introduction to the book that we're going to spend these next few weeks in. We don't know much about Habakkuk. We know his name. He was unfortunately given the name that had to have been used as a nickname. I mean, they had to have called him Habby. I have to believe in school it was shortened. Had to be. For the sake of reverence, I will not refer to him as Habby. From here, we will continue to give him his given name as Habakkuk. But his name means this, to embrace. I think there's some meaning in there. But I'm not going to spend my time this morning telling you what I think that meaning is. I'm going to let you follow along through this series and see if you can make any connection between the name to embrace and the theme of the book. We don't know much about him. We do know his name, but we don't know exactly when he wrote. We have an idea, though, because of some of the indicators that are given to us in Scripture. There are two big indicators that help us be able to locate an approximate time in the history of God's people. One of those is Habakkuk mentions a moral decline. Now, of course, with God's people, there are many options in which that could be a moral decline or a season of a moral falling away, a season of tremendous growing, abounding unrighteousness on a national level. There are many options that we have to be able to point to that in their history. But there's another indicator that's given to us. God says in chapter 1 that He is raising up the Chaldeans or the Babylonians to come and to literally overpower Israel, overpower God's people. So we know it's a season of unrighteousness, And we know it's before God uses the Babylonians to invade and carry off God's people. So when you think of the season of unrighteousness and when that could be, it's either many believe under the rule of evil King Manasseh, or it's after the rule of King Josiah, who was a good king and saw great revival. But after King Josiah died, the revival kind of sputtered out and unrighteousness began to abound. We believe that this was written sometime around 650 BC to 598 BC, before Israel was carried off and attacked and invaded by the Babylonians. All that to be said, let's jump into the meat of this. Would you join me? Let's read verses 1 through 4 together. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you will not hear, or cry to you violence and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence arise before me, strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. What's his question? God, how long shall I cry for help, and you're not going to hear? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? That's the question. How long and why? He's looking out among an unrighteous nation where justice is perverted. Nobody's doing what's right. They're all falling away. Violence is taking over the nation, which, by the way, that word for violence is the same word that was used in the book of Genesis to describe the earth when God flooded it in Noah's day. Same word exactly that God was using. So Habakkuk is looking around his nation, and he sees justice and injustices. He sees violence. He sees fighting everywhere. We don't know anything about that, do we? We don't look around and see injustice, violence, fighting. We don't look around and see the bad seeming to win while the good seem to lose. We don't know anything about that, of course, right? We don't know anything about crying out to God, saying, God, this world is messed up. God, our country is messed up. When are you going to do something about this? Is that really Habakkuk's question? How long are you going to make me look at this, God? How long are you not going to do anything about this? Listen, that's not Habakkuk's core question. Habakkuk's core question is not how long are you going to make me look at this, God? His core question isn't how long are you going to make me go through this, God? Habakkuk's core question is this: God, do you care? That's Habakkuk's question. God, I see this is not right. I see idolatry. I see violence. I see arguments. I see fighting. I see murder. I see all of this, God. And on the other side, you are doing nothing about it. Do you not care? Have you not been there? Have you ever asked that question of God? Maybe born from a season of pain, confusion, grief, anger, resentment, disappointment. You've been there. You got the call from the doctor you didn't want to hear. You got the letter from your husband, the Dear John letter. You got the news about your son or your daughter. Maybe something happened. Maybe you lost your job. Maybe you were laid off. Who knows what it was? An economic downturn. Maybe something happened in your life and you're like, no, wait a second, God. This stinks. It's been stinking for a long time and you're not doing anything about it. Do you care? You may feel like the disciples out on the boat in the middle of the storm. You're pretty sure you're going to die, and there's Jesus asleep. You wake him up. God, don't you care? God, don't you care about this pain that I'm feeling? Don't you care that I'm hurting and that I've got questions? God, don't you care that it feels like my doubt is hanging by a string? Don't you care? I've been there. I've asked that question. I've cried that question. And I'm sure there are many in this room that have done the same thing. Part of the reason why I wanted that subtitle to be in this series and why it's not a bad thing is this right here. Because questions, these kind of questions, these big God questions, do some very important things. We're going to reference this all throughout this series. These big God questions do many things, but I want to list 3 things they do. Let me illustrate it by doing this. Yes, I'm going to take these big God questions and I'm going to use an illustration about a dishwasher, okay? Forgive me, but it's the best I got. Just last week, my wife and I were cleaning up the kitchen, more her than me, but she and I were cleaning up the kitchen, and the dishes were all put in the dishwasher, and we went to push the button like we have hundreds of times before to make it go and wash dishes, and it didn't do it. So she tells me, she says, honey, I don't remember what term of endearment you used for me that day, the dishwasher's not working. So as a man, you know what the first thing I did was? This was the first thing I said. It's always the man's first thing he says. Second thing I said is, why isn't it working? That's honestly, that's how that happened. That is a transcript of everything that happened right there. I went, okay, it's not working. Why isn't it working? So what do? I push the button again. Same response. Nothing. Not even a light. Not even a beep to tell me I'm on the track. Nothing. I push it, nothing. Open the door, shut it. Push it, nothing. Open the door, shut it harder. Push it again, nothing. It's nothinging me to death. Something's wrong. So you know what I did? I asked the question, why isn't this working? Now seriously though, think about this. The 3 things these big God questions do is kind of revealed in that question I had for the dishwasher in this. First, these big God questions reveal care, concern, or interest on our part. When I'm asking God, why? When I'm asking God, like Abraham did, God, how are you going to do this? When I'm asking God, like Moses did in the brick pits with his people, God, why are you doing this and why did you send me? When I'm asking those big God questions, it is revealing that I have care, concern, or interest. I had deep care, deep concern, and deep interest in the dishwasher running because I'm number 2 in line. If it doesn't work, I do. I pay that the big money to do it so I don't have to. Number 2, they reveal a quest or answers for truth. Why isn't this working? I need to know. That's me saying, I don't know why it's working, and I need to find out. Why? Because I have a concern, care, or interest. So what do? I pull the dishwasher out. I find out, for those of you that are wondering, first service never got to hear this. I found out that the cord had been severed. I don't know who would have done that. Evil. Here's the third and probably the most important thing that these questions do. They reveal presuppositions we all have. This is important. When I ask a question, when I ask that question from my heart to God, do you care? Do you know what I'm saying? I'm saying, God, I come to this moment believing that you care, but I'm not seeing it. What was Habakkuk's question? God, do you care what I'm having to go through down here? God, do you care what's going on with your people? Why did he ask that? Because he had a presupposition about who God was. He believed that God was holy. He believed that God cared about the affairs and the effects of his people. He believed that God was separated from evil and didn't want to see that he had a better plan for his people. Habakkuk comes to this moment where what he is seeing in the world does not match up with his presupposition about who God is. Now, take all of this for a moment and back it up. If this is true, and every person in the world at some point has had that question pop in their head, God, do you care? Then what does that tell us about our presupposition about God? If I really believe that everybody has had that question at some point, then it presupposes that I come to that place believing that there is a divine being that cares about me. If not, I wouldn't have asked the question. God, what I see doesn't match up with what I know you to be or what I believe you to be. I believe. Help my unbelief. God, do you care? Look at that God's answer in verse 5. Number 2, God's answer. Look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded, for I'm doing a work in your days that you would not believe if you were told. For behold, I'm raising up the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, and they pile up earth and take it. And when they sweep by like wind and go on, guilty men whose own might is their God. Verse 12, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them as reproof. What's God tell Habakkuk? God, aren't you going to do something about this? Don't you care? What's God say? Oh, Habakkuk, I care. You know, one of the problems about asking God big God questions is we might get big God answers. And maybe we don't want the big God answer that we may get. And Habakkuk got it. Remember what his question was, oh Lord, how long do I need to look? And how long do I need to see all this? You know what God tells him in verse 5? Habakkuk, go look and go see. God uses the exact same Hebrew word back to Habakkuk and tell him, I want you to do this, Habakkuk. I want you to get up and I want you to look out at all of the nations. I want you to keep your eye on the horizon. That's what God tells him. What God is doing is changing his focus. He's redirecting the focus of Habakkuk. Habakkuk is focused on himself. God, why do I have to see this? How long am I going to have to endure this? What God says is take your eyes off of you for a moment and look out at the nations. Look out at the borders. By the way, in the original language, this is written in the second person. The pronouns are used in the second person. What he's saying is what God is saying is literally all of you, go look, all of you, see. You know what God is saying? You may want to jot this down. God is telling Habakkuk, yes, Habakkuk, I am observant. I know what's going on. When you're in that moment and you've got that question, it's bubbling up. It's getting pushed up by the pain. It's getting pushed up by the confusion. It's coming up and you can't stop it, and you blow it out, and you say, God, do you care? Know this. He knows what you're going through. He knows what you're experiencing. He knows everything about it. Now, as much as I say this, as much as I tell you to hold on to that in and of itself, I don't believe brings much comfort. In fact, I would say it would almost be cruelty for me to be going through a painful season of my life, for me to call out to God and for God to simply say, I know. What comfort would it bring to know that God is aware of my situation if He does nothing about it, right? That's why God makes sure Habakkuk knows this. Habakkuk, I don't just see, I'm not just observant. But Habakkuk, I'm orchestrating events. I am moving nations. That's what God says. I am raising up a mean and violent and ungodly people. Habakkuk wasn't the only one to prophesy the rise of the Babylonians, to reprove God's people. Jeremiah spoke of the Babylonians coming. Isaiah spoke that they would ride in and carry them off. Micah spoke of them coming and hauling off God's people and their possessions. God's people were in captivity for 70 years under the Babylonians. God says, I'm not just aware, Habakkuk, I'm orchestrating events. Now I'm starting to feel a little more peace. Because God's not just saying this is not just dealing with God's omniscience. Now I'm starting to see His hands. Jamie, I know it hurts. I know this is uncomfortable. I know you have questions. I see it. I know it. And Jamie, I want you to know that I am taking right now and I am moving things around. You can't see it. That's what God's saying to Habakkuk. You can't see it. Get up and look. Look out at the nations. See. Train your eyes on the borders. You can't see it. And God goes on to say, even if you can see it, you wouldn't believe it even if somebody told you. If you picked up the newspaper tomorrow, Habakkuk, and it said that the Babylonians have been raised by God to come and to wipe out Israel, you would throw that paper away and believe it's trash. God says to Habakkuk, I'm doing something that you can't see and you cannot even understand. What Habakkuk is remembering or is seeing now is that God knows about his situation, has always known about his situation, and in a spot where Habakkuk cannot see, God is orchestrating events and moving them around. Why? Number 3, God has a desired outcome. God has a desired outcome. Now, I can breathe. Now, I can lay down and rest. Because God doesn't just know what I'm going through. He's not just using His hands to maneuver and to orchestrate events, but now God is putting them exactly in the place that He wants them to go. Why? Because He has a purpose. I may not like it. It may not have been the purpose, it may not have been the curriculum that I wanted. It may not have been the news that I wanted. But what I see here is God's response. He says, I know I'm doing something, even if you can't see it, and it's working out for my plan. You see, what if we're not really looking for an answer? What if? What if I'm looking for something much deeper? I have to believe that in the moments of my greatest despair, in the moments of my greatest confusion, I have to believe that what I'm really seeking is not an answer, but a person. I believe that person is Jesus. I need to know Jesus. You're aware, you're working, you've got an outcome planned. You're able to work through any situation in life. Habakkuk just heard some hard news. It would be like us hearing that Al-Qaeda or ISIS is going to invade our country and take us all hostage and take all of our things. That's kind of what Habakkuk has heard. And of course, upon hearing that news, you would think that Habakkuk's response would be this: oh God, come on. Seriously, God, that's what you're going to do? That's what we would think Habakkuk's response would be, but it's not. It's not. Look at verse 12. Are you not from everlasting? Oh, Lord, my God. What does he say? Upon having this response from God that an evil nation is going to be raised up by God, and they're going to come in, they're going to take that nation down and haul them off. What does Habakkuk say? Oh, God, you are eternal. He is praising God, it seems. I need to remember that. God, you transcend time. You created time, therefore you are not bound by it. You are outside of time. You see everything. As the prophets say, you see the beginning from the end. You transcend time. He doesn't just stop there. He says, "Oh, my Holy One, my Lord." What Habakkuk is saying to God is, God, you are who I thought you are. Remember, his problem was, I see all this evil down here and I see a God who's not doing anything about it. What does he say after God responds? He says, you're eternal and you are holy. Do we understand what holy means? It means there is absolutely no wrong. It is impossible for God to do wrong. He will never do wrong, ever. Everything God does is good. He is only good. And Habakkuk knew that. He says that here. Now, don't get me wrong. He still has questions. We'll get to question number 2 next week. But here, he says, God, you're everlasting and you're holy. We shall not die. Seems like a weird thing to put in there, doesn't it? You know what Habakkuk's saying? God, do you remember your covenant? You promised us. You promised us we'd be your people. What Habakkuk is saying is, God, I know your character, and I know you're not going to go back on your word. It would be impossible for you to go back on your word because you're holy. I need to remember that. I need to remember who God is, and I need to remember who I am in Him in the midst of that. And then he says, O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for reproof. Here's the purpose. I see, God. You're bringing them to deal with us because of our sin. He doesn't like that answer, but He has an answer. He understands it. Now, don't misunderstand me this morning, please. Don't walk out of here and believe for a moment that every bad thing that happens to you is a result of your sin. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that every season that you go through that is difficult and challenging and brings up questions, I'm not saying that every one of those is God getting you back for something you did. No, but I will say this. We know that all things work together for the good to those who love God and are the called according to His purpose. I know that everything that happens in my life, God is using to shape me into the nature or to the image of His Son, Jesus Christ. I know that God may refine me through challenging times. I know that God is molding me and making me. I know that He is transforming me into the image of His Son. He is fitting me for heaven. And that often comes through painful lessons down here. My situation may not be the result of my sin. It may be the result of someone else's sin or living in a fallen world. We can never always know for sure exactly why the things happen, but what we can know is this, is that God has a plan. God was shaping His followers. I want to share with you this final point. My goal this morning is not through this series to hear you say, you're right, Pastor, when I say, does God care? Yes. It's not my goal. I have found the answer to that question to be yes. In all cases, in all situations, God cares for me. I know that. But my answer carries very little weight for you. I don't want to hear you say, you're right, Pastor. I would rather you say, that's right, Pastor. You've got to be able to find that answer for yourself. And you know what? It requires faith. God, this does stink. Maybe there's pain, loss, trauma. You've been carrying around that question and it hasn't been answered. This morning, could you believe what the Bible says about God? Do you care, God? Yes. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul mentions tragedies. And he refers to them as a light affliction that's producing something. And I want to ask you this morning, could you be willing to take that step and say, God, I believe that in the midst of my pain, in the midst of my confusion, you care. You know about it. You're orchestrating events, and you have a desired outcome from this. Do you care, God? Yes. For God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. Father, this morning, as we consider these very important questions, I pray that you'll bring healing and restoration to our heart. Father, maybe the enemy has used that season of pain to drive a wedge between us and you. And I pray this morning you would restore that relationship, that you would tear down that wall. That as Habakkuk was able to see, God, you do care, you have always cared, and you will always care. You are eternal, you are holy, you will never forget the covenant you made with your people. You're working this all out for your purpose and your glory and honor. Father, I pray that this brings comfort, a respite to those who are under the yoke of this pain. Yes, God, you do care. Help us to walk in that today. In Jesus' name, amen.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to our podcast at First Baptist Joplin. If you are interested in coming and worshiping with us live, we would love for you to come at 9 and 10:30 on Sunday mornings.